everybody, how's it going? Thanks for joining me this afternoon. I've got a great stream with a great guest that I think you're really going to enjoy. So, Caesarism is something that always comes up when we're kind of looking at the cycles of history. It's a phenomenon that is recurring over and over again in civilizations. Many people are captivated by it, and it is something that I think is relevant today because somebody who's talked a lot about Caesarism, Oswald Spengler, said that we might be in the times of it, or we might be approaching that season in our civilization. So I thought it would be important to go back and look at the historical roots of Caesarism. Of course, who is Julius Caesar first, like getting that historical context. And then what does the term mean? What can we look at and how it applies to kind of the world around us today? So joining me today to talk about all of that is Furius Pertinax. Thank you so much for joining me, man.
Good morning, everyone. It was nice to get to this conversation, and I know we've been sort of talking about it back and forth for a couple of weeks, but and you're quite right. You know, it's such a fundamental part of people sort of in our realm of politics to discuss, the idea of Caesar and Caesarism, and of course, for those who are familiar with Spengler, so it's a theme that is quite obvious in his writing, but it sometimes is the historical context of Caesar himself is a bit lost, and I think often, and we all are guilty of it, I've probably done it as well, is we throw around that phraseology a lot unless someone is intimately knowledgeable of the subject. His context historically and the pathway of his life and what sort of defines Caesar is a bit lost in the wash. And I think it's a really good conversation to have to actually get into the sort of nitty gritty of not just Julius Caesar the man, but where does Caesarism sit contextually within, in terms of the historicity of the subject.
Yeah, and so we're going to try to do a little zooming in and zooming out. We're going to be focusing again on who Julius Caesar was, what kind of forces shaped him, what kind of world he was born into, what kind of made the original Caesar a Caesar. But then we'll also go ahead and zoom up and out and look at the wider context of kind of how this cycle of history occurs, how these forces can appear not just in ancient Rome, but other places, and what kind of conclusions we can draw from that today. But before we dive into all that, guys, let's go ahead and hear from today's sponsor. This episode is brought to you by the Intercollegiate Studies Institute. The Intercollegiate Studies Institute is a conservative nonprofit dedicated to educating the next great American. ISI understands that conservatives and right-of-center students feel isolated on college campuses and compelled to defend their reputation and dignity while seeking to carve out a brighter future. ISI has a variety of different content, events, internships, and fellowships geared towards helping students and opening up career opportunities. ISI offers graduate students and entry-level journalists the opportunity to receive fellowships and secure internships. Nate Hochman, who's been a guest on this show multiple times, got his start at National Review through ISI. He's been one of many journalists and academics who were able to start their career with the help of ISI. And in the fall, everyone's favorite, Tucker Carlson, will be giving the keynote address at ISI's annual gala. On all issues, both economic and cultural, ISI wants their students to know that they aren't shying away from the problems facing our country, because letting the left win is a pathetic way to watch civilization die. To learn more, check out isi.org. That's isi.org. You can follow the link down in the description of the video. All right, so as we go ahead and get started, the first thing we want to do is put this in context. We want to put this in historical context. Before Julius Caesar is even born, obviously, the world around him is shaping the kind of situation he's going to be in. A lot of people, of course, look at Julius Caesar and his rise as the downfall of the Roman Republic. But I think for people who are more familiar with Roman history, they understand that this was going for a long time, that Julius Caesar was really more of the end of a process than the beginning. Some people look at the Gracchi, some people look at Marius and Sulla. But Furius, can you give us a little bit of context? What are kind of the key events that we need to understand as we look at the world that Julius Caesar was kind of stepping into?
Yeah, so you mentioned Marius and Sulla, who are this era that we're discussing of destabilization and sort of tumult within Rome doesn't begin with Marius and Sulla. They are merely a very a very important hinge pin in the trajectory of how this sort of goes about. But if you actually look at this sort of historical path of the Roman Republic, particularly after, it's worth noting that there's sort of a delineation between, say, Rome prior to the Punic Wars, or certainly the Second Punic War, and then Rome after the Second Punic War, which becomes, you sort of have this this nascent Roman city-state that spends 300 years becoming the hegemon of the Italian peninsula over its Latin and Oscan neighbors, the Etruscans to the north, the Umbrians, and to the south, the Samnites and these other sort of tribes who share, in a broad sense, sort of like an Italic identity with Rome. Their languages aren't always identical, but they're usually similar. But they they share, you might say, an ethnos with the Latins, which the Romans are. In fact, Rome's first alliance is called the Latin League, which it shares with its immediate Latin neighbors, for instance. And that process takes centuries. It takes 300-400 years for it to sort of become a regional power and to sort of accrue its sort of position as the hegemon of Italy, as we would sort of understand Italy today. And then it engages in these two very enduring savage wars with Carthage. Carthage being Rome's great power across the sea in North Africa. Modern day Tunis is the location of where the city of Carthage was, and these are people who are of a Phoenician extraction from the great trading cities of Tyre, Sidon, Byblos in the Near East. And then once Rome crushes them in the Third Punic War, they actually destroy Carthage. They quite literally tear the city down brick by brick. Rome in itself, it becomes a power of the Western Mediterranean. It sort of starts to attain this size and stature, which then compares it to the great kingdoms of the East. These remnant powers, which are the successor states of Alexander. The Greeks call them the Diadochi. This is the kingdom of Macedon. This is Ptolemaic Egypt, and this is the powers in the east, the Seleucid Empire. And Rome then engages sort of, because as happens with friction and power and expansion, Rome comes to blows with them, and then sort of Rome then expands, and it in three wars it conquers Macedon, and the conquest of Macedon trebles the size of the Roman treasury, for instance. Rome then engages in a succession of wars throughout the Mediterranean, just expands. And what was this sort of nascent city-state that could govern, a couple of provinces in Italy, that could actually govern Italy as a sort of a nation state, as we might conceptualize it today? It's still trying to utilize this aristocratic republican system to govern what is very rapidly becoming an empire. There's a very good piece that was mentioned by, he's one of my favorite historians on the subject, Professor Keith Hopkins. He was of Cambridge University. He's now deceased, but he said that following the Second Punic War, the Romans celebrated 70 triumphs within 200 years, and a triumph was never issued to a general unless they were killed a minimum of 5,000 of the enemy in any given battle. So it wasn't just thrown around willy-nilly. Like, triumphs were earned by their generals, and this demonstrates the scale of Roman expansion and the rapidness of it. And by Rome gaining all this territory, yes, it becomes powerful, but a couple of things happen. Is that, one, there's a gradual but dramatic attrition of its because prior to Marius, Gaius Marius, Rome isn't sort of like a professionalized army with volunteers and recruits. Rome is essentially a levy-based semi-professional militia. It just so happens that it's very well trained and it's very strong and well equipped by the state. But actually, technically, they had their own arms and armor, but like the state did, provide other things. But it was constantly fighting and expanding, and so it would deploy these armies. But there was always attrition. I mean, if you look at the Second Punic War, Rome suffers a horrendous degree of military attrition against the Carthaginians. Take the Battle of Cannae. Most people are familiar with it. Rome loses 65,000 men in an afternoon of fighting against Hannibal. And this sort of happens generation over generation over generation. And so these sort of essentially fathers and sons and brothers of landed Romans, who were the recruitment base for the army, are becoming depleted. And so what happens? Eventually, by the time that we get to Gaius Marius, we have the so-called Cimbrian Wars, which is this massive migration of Germans from basically modern-day Denmark and northern Germany. They make their way to the Italian peninsula, via the River Rhine Valley and into the Alps, and they defeat 2 or 3 Roman armies across southern Gaul and the Alps. And meanwhile, Marius himself is in Africa fighting the Jugurthine War against the Numidians. And Rome is basically tapped out of manpower. So Marius is brought back to Rome after he wraps up the Numidian conflict. The Roman state basically say he's voted consul, which makes him one of the two leaders of Rome for that year. And they say they give Marius carte blanche to basically build a new army. So basically Marius attends to the idea of utilizing the so-called head count, which is the sort of freedman population of Rome that aren't tied to land. They're not descendants of landowners. They're not sort of the traditional basis of Roman manpower. And of course, people flock to the army in order to gain, you might say, a living and a salary and the promise of citizenship and land as was offered to them at this point. And Marius creates this new army, and he defeats the Cimbri and their allies in a couple of battles, culminating in the Battle of Vercellae, which is fought on the foothills of the Alps on the Italian side. And then we're sort of presented with, the Sulla Marius stuff, which I know you've talked about before. But the reason I mentioned about the army and the expansion is because it has killed successive generations of brothers and sons and fathers who would have tended to land and would have maintained this, you might say, this strata of probably people that, if we could use a modern analogy, would have been kulaks. They were, land attending farmer types. You know how we sort of joke about the U.S. Army is made up of corn-fed Iowa and Missouri boys and Texas boys. That idea. That's the people who were in the Roman legions prior to Marius and Sulla. But a lot of them have died over centuries and centuries of fighting over many, many generations. And so what's happened is that Rome, by winning spoils and winning war, has brought in a lot of gold into Rome. Like I said, when they annexed Macedon, the kingdom of the Antigonid kingdom of Macedon, Rome trebled the size of its treasury in one campaign. And of course, with victory becomes slaves. The Romans accrued a huge number of slaves over its 2 or 3 centuries of fighting after the Carthaginian Wars. And a lot of slaves are brought to Italy. And and this is the class element that starts to get interesting, is that a lot of slaves come into Rome who can afford slaves en masse. It's the aristocrats, it's the moneyed classes, it's the sort of merchant classes and their sort of alliance, with the aristocrats who actually have money in Rome. And then at the same time, because these agricultural areas become bereft of the young men who would otherwise inherit these properties off their fathers or grandfathers, are simply not there to do so. So many aristocrats start accumulating vast swaths of land in Italy, and they create what we call in Latin latifundia, which are basically the Spanish have a similar term. They call them haciendas, which is sort of a similar idea, but these vast agricultural estates around like a big villa. And rather than being attended to by freed people or by indentured servants, it would be slaves. They'll just be put on these farms, and it would be a large plot of land owned by one person who would then buy a lot of slaves who then attend to the land. It's a very different structure to what the Romans had as a smaller city-state.
So if we could just stop there for a second, I want to go ahead and investigate a little bit of that, because there's a lot of ground, but I think it's really important to note some of these structural shifts and these social shifts. So like you said, originally you've got obviously a city-state. This is kind of the standard formation of governance and kind of civilization at that time. But the constant expansion is creating a very different situation. We're looking at the fact that the type of government that used to govern this, the kind of the republic, which was really based on this kind of more enclosed local version of governance, something that is very specific to the people inside of the city state, is now becoming insufficient. It's
absolutely.
And at the same time, we're also seeing a shift in the economy and military structure, because if I remember correctly, like even some of the names for Roman classes came from their ability, like their financial ability to purchase their own arms. Like if you could afford a horse, you were part of a different class, right?
Equites is what they were called, which becomes it's where we get equine for horses from. It's from a class of men who rode horses in the Roman army. Exactly.
Precisely. Yeah. So even our own words today are impacted. Our own language today are impacted by kind of the social and military structure that was kind of baked in. And so at this point, Rome, originally Rome has kind of more of that standard understanding of its polity. It has it only includes those in the city-state. This citizenship is particularly guarded. And the military force isn't perhaps volunteer is the wrong word, but it's understood as the duty of free men who own land,
Mm,
citizens. It's
yeah,
something that would be a position of honor and something that you would do because you could afford it and because it was your duty. But like you said, there's so many of these wars of conquest that it's hollowed out the middle, what we might think of as a middle class. And
yeah,
so now not only do you not have that base of the military, you didn't even have that base of land owning labor. And so we're
yeah,
seeing a transformation, not just of the military, not just of the government, but the population and the economic situation as well, where we get what you might say mass immigration of a sort into the area in order to fill in that middle class deficit that's been brought by wars of expansion. And this creates a big class division between those who perhaps at one time would have held land, would have had the middle class existence, would have had that free, farmer type existence, now being displaced by large amounts of slaves and the wealthy people who are able to kind of accumulate these vast estates under which they work.
precisely. That's exactly right. And those two sort of phenomena happen in unison. Is that once there's a sort of gradual hollowing out of that strata of that class, as we might call them, the Roman equivalent of the kulaks. Once they're sort of hollowed out and made almost a non-existent entity within the Roman system, we start to see this breakdown coming at play, because that also happens with this enriching of this aristocratic class. And there's quite the deviation sort of occurs. And I mean, before the show, we mentioned the brothers Gracchi, etc. And there's this major deviation in Roman politics between, and it reaches its apex certainly under Caesar, and once he engages in the civil war, which comes a little bit later. But you have the populares and the optimates, basically the populists and the aristocrats, the optimates, the higher ups, as I would call themselves. But and this is why I think this conversation is so important, because we're sort of getting into the genesis of how these two factions come into being. What actually is the driving factors to these two forces coalescing in Roman politics? And so, and exactly. So when Marius reforms this army, he transforms it into a volunteer / recruitment system that's entirely professionalized. The actual Roman state itself creates all the equipment. They manufacture the Roman helmets and the Roman shields and the Roman, armor and arms as we sort of imagine them. They didn't use the plates back then, like the chain mail and the big Roman helmets and stuff that we can imagine from TV. It was sort of more or less that, and each Roman was sort of uniformly equipped in a very specific and standardized fashion. And that army sort of setup becomes successful. But the problem is that rather than the Senate themselves appointing generals who will then, command a consular army, and then once that war is fought, they sort of come back home. And as we know, then it's so important talking about Caesar is they can't technically cross the Rubicon, which is the delineation between Italy and Cisalpine Gaul. They can't do so at the head of an army. So they'll separate the army from the commander. The commander goes to Rome. The army's kind of like disbanded, but then they sort of make their way back home afterwards. And the system worked where sort of after Marius, what happens is these volunteers who aren't necessarily fulfilling a patriotic duty in the same way that a land-based sort of militia is probably not right, because it's not really a militia, but I suppose it works like a militia. How these militiamen are embraced by the state, they fight their battle, they go home. It's a very sort of patriotic duty, whereas for volunteers it's more, you join for the glory and for the spoils, and if a general throws you a few crumbs, you actually have more loyalty to the general than to the state or to the Senate, which becomes the perennial problem in Rome.
Yeah, I think it's really important to notice that one right here is that shift between the loyalty, you know, average guy, middle class guy, freed guy with some land, and these are the guys who are constructing your force. And then that shift to the volunteers, these are no longer average people called up expecting to go do their tour and then come back home and farm. These are specifically people who are looking to make this in many ways a job, or to acquire social, to climb socially, to get material gain. The spoils that could be offered by the generals becomes a big driving point. And once the general raising a legion is able to offer that legion specific things based on their ability to win battles or something, then it matters what legion you're joining. You're not really joining Rome, you're joining the general's force for the things that can be delivered to you. And that
Correct.
creates a relationship that is very different. You're no longer the military of Rome, you're no longer loyal to Rome, you're loyal to the specific man who's taking you into battle.
Exactly right, because it's the success or the failure of that general which then determines the fate of those soldiers, and it could be just a humble, an entrant man who might not even be middle class, could even be low class, could even be a freed slave. You got to think the Legion was open to almost anyone. In some instances, in the rarest of instances, say for example, even preparing for the war against the Cimbri, which Rome was, it was a hair's breadth away from losing one way or the other, because of the manpower situation in Rome. They were even offering clemency to criminals at this point. Like it was a bit like we're sort of seeing in our current day, prisoners being armed and equipped to volunteer to fight because to preserve the state. If you get my drift, we see this across history, and this is one example where it actually does happen. And so men, especially the lower you go in class strata, the more dependent they become on the fate of their general, whether he succeeds or fails on the battlefield for Rome, shall I say. And this is also where it's sort of important too, that you have this sort of break or this sort of genesis of the optimates and the populares. And so I suppose we'll just speed run it really quickly, that sort of Sulla was initially a subordinate of Marius, and then Marius, he has a success against the Cimbri. I think he's voted consul like 8 or 10 times. Like it's actually on an unprecedented degree to which he's voted consul. Meanwhile, Lucius Cornelius Sulla is fighting in the east against what we call the Mithridatic Wars, which is sort of modern day northeastern Turkey is sort of where we're talking, just on a map. And then sort of it comes to a head. Sulla marches on Rome. He eviscerates the populares, and this is kind of important because this also plays into Caesar. So Caesar is born in 100 BC, and these events are taking place in sort of 90 and 80 BC. Actually, just before the Eastern campaigns, we obviously have the Social War, which we'd mentioned at the very start of the stream. And this is when the Italian allies, who have been almost bled dry from Rome, in the same way that Rome has sort of denuded its own rural military classes through centuries of fighting, its Italian allies, and I mentioned them before, the Umbrians, the Samnites, the Lucanians, these other Italic peoples, shall I say, who populate Italy, who share an ethnos and a kinship with Rome, but they're not Romans, right? They are different. You might say they're people with a different identity, but share the Roman ethnos. Let's just call it. That's the simplest way to put it. They eventually, because they're considered a different level of class than, say, what native Romans are, they rebel. And although the rebellion is actually suppressed, of which I believe Caesar's uncle actually is a general in this war, and Sulla actually ironically serves under him as well, the Romans suppress this social war, but because it's a difficult situation for Rome itself because of its manpower situation and just not wanting to plummet Italy into more chaos, because Italy is it's the heart of the Republic. It is the commercial heart, the economic heart, the agricultural heart of the Republic. They can't afford turmoil at home. So they suppress the revolt, but they grant the wishes of the rebellion. And that is the extension of citizenship to all the Italian peoples of Italy, or the Italics, right? And so you already have great civil disturbance within Rome itself. Sulla fights in the east against Mithridates of Pontus. He comes back with his army. Him and Marius come to a head, and obviously Sulla takes Rome. He sets himself up as dictator of Rome. He engages in the first proscriptions, which Gaius Julius Caesar, the man who's the center point of this discussion, survives the proscription. Although he...
Let's be clear for people who may not be familiar what a proscription is.
Yes. Okay. A prescription is basically like a hit list of people who are considered enemies of the state by either the ruling elite or by a dictator who's raised to ultimate power in Rome. And I might touch on the dictator thing perhaps at the end of the stream, because I got a little bone to pick there. But nonetheless, yes, a prescription is essentially a hit list of people who are either executed or exiled, often without trial. So it's sort of like almost the equivalent of like a Soviet purge, I suppose, is a good modern comparison to use.
And
You
also
happy with
very
that, John?
importantly, yeah, and also very importantly, your land and possessions are seized. And so it's a way not
Correct.
only to get rid of political enemies, but also to create wealth, to increase your
Mm,
treasury, or to benefit your friends by getting rid of some wealthy people and then redistributing their
mm.
wealth to maybe some troops that you promised farmland
Yeah.
to, or something like
Mm.
that.
Or if you have a politician who comes on side, you reward them at the cost of your enemies,
Exactly.
sort of you're playing favorites, etc. And you sort of see that much later, say like with the second triumvirate of Octavian and Anthony, they sort of like pay off Lepidus in that sort of same way. But
Exactly. Yeah.
that's a different era. But anyway, this is a good example of it. But yes, so what actually occurs here is that at this point, Caesar escapes the prescriptions by joining the army in Asia, and that's kind of important because a lot of people don't realize that the Julii, the gens Julii, which Caesar belongs to, is an old family. It's one of the oldest aristocratic families in Rome, sort of alongside the Fabii and the Livii and the Brutii. These old families that sort of trace their lineage almost back to the foundation of the Republic when they kicked out the Etruscan kings in like 500 BC. But the family itself has been on the wane, and even though his uncle, the one who I said fought in the social war, was governor of Roman Macedonia, and Caesar's father himself was governor of the Roman province of Asia, which corresponds with that western half of modern day Turkey, what we call Anatolia. He was the propraetor of Asia. The family has not been a success politically. It's not a financial success. The family is actually struggling, and so Caesar's sort of born into this position where the family itself is struggling, but his uncle on his mother's side, who is Marius, has been a successful consul, has fought the Cimbrian Wars, is a hero, and is considered a hero by the, as we sort of now come to know them, the Populares faction. So sort of Caesar has this notoriety that on one hand makes him kind of like famous before he's famous himself, but B, he's also got a bit of a target on the back of his head in terms of how the Optimates see him. He's definitely someone to watch out for.
So this might also be a good time to kind of explain a little bit of the populares, and land reform is a big issue here between these two parties, right? These two factions.
Mm. Exactly, which is why you have the murders essentially of the brothers Gracchi, who actually want to engage in. Funny how we sort of actually kind of unrelated, but I was scrolling through Twitter and I sort of saw a statement by JFK Jr. about like, oh, we need a peaceful solution to this, and it's kind of funny how like the brothers Gracchi exemplify that idea of a peaceful political resolution to a problem, and then when there's a political force that denies that peaceful solution from being able to happen, ultimately one faction gives the other faction no other alternative.
Mm-hmm.
But you get where I'm going with that. Is that in ancient Rome, this plays out between this increasing degrees of friction between the populares and the optimates, and so Caesar being of many of his family members being a part of the populares, he flees east. He joins the legions in Asia where his dad was governor. He fights campaigns, gains his military experience in early age, and he actually wins commendations despite being an aristocrat. He's leading a century of men. He wins honors and accolades. Because I think they're sort of engaging in anti-piracy duties in the Aegean, and he already gains at this point at a young age a following of hard what would call like the cadre, the thin edge of the wedge, like these elite men who recognize his talent and follow him, and he gains a notoriety to quite a young age. You're talking like 15, 16, 17 here. Like he's literally a high schooler at this point, and he's earning these accolades in the military. And then once Sulla he dies, and his dictatorship ends in Rome, so he makes his way back to Rome, and then being a man in his 20s, he's obviously an aristocrat. He begins to engage in Roman life in the political sense, which was you might say, the birthright of the aristocratic classes. And then that's that story about him going to Rhodes and he's captured by the pirates. And I kind of want to touch on this slightly. I don't get bogged down in it, but it's just about Caesarism and about the kind of personality a Caesar is that what is remarkable about this incident where he gets captured, he's on the way to, because he's sent to Rhodes to study, and I always forget the Greek scholar's name, but he goes to learn oratory and rhetoric, right? And he's captured on the way by these pirates who have this little cove somewhere in the Eastern Aegean, probably on the Asian landmass somewhere, and they capture him, and it's immediate that Caesar already has this supreme self-confidence. When they ask for a ransom of 20 talents, Caesar bursts out laughing, and he says to them, don't you know who I am? My family will volunteer 50 talents. Like, he's already got an extremely high opinion of himself.
Well, yeah, I love the story because, he kind of, in many ways, earns a little bit of the respect of the pirates. He's like running, he's running races with them, and he's like, he's kind of just being a bro with these guys, and they kind of take a shining to him in some ways, respect for him in some ways. And so this whole time, but the whole time he's just like, eventually I'm going to come back and crucify all of you, for holding me. And they're like, yeah, okay, Caesar, that's great. Good for you. I bet you are,
Yeah, nice one, plush aristocrat. Like, sure,
exactly.
Come and like kill us like hardy pirates who are, cutthroat, whatever. And exactly. And I mean, and this is the thing too, like, even while he's captive, like, he reads them his poetry, and they, because they're not an educated people, that they are just, quite, lowly pirates. They don't understand, Aesop's fables or something, and they sort of laugh at him, and he castigates them. He's the captive, but he's actually saying to them, "You're stupid, illiterate barbarians, and I'm going to come back. I'm going to crucify you. And listen, I'm going to sleep. Keep the noise down. I actually want to sleep tonight." Like, he flips the switch entirely. Like, this is his character. This is his nature as a young man. He's in his early 20s, and then, like you say, the ransom's paid. He leaves the captivity from where he's kept at. And what does he do? Because he fought in Asia, he's familiar with most of the commanders and the disposition of Roman forces in the Aegean. He goes to the nearest naval base that's in the Aegean. I think it might be Lesbos or Samos. I can't remember the Greek island. Cobbles together half a dozen Roman ships and, a couple of centuries of Roman troops. And, well, he goes straight back to the island, and he takes the island and he captures the pirates. But because he sort of enjoyed them, he appreciated their company, rather than actually leaving them to hang on the crucifixes, he actually executes them, like, as a mercy, shall I say. So Caesar kind of has this really odd idea of mercy, if you get what I mean. But that's the ancient world. Like, they have different morality to what we do today.
Yeah,
but that's Caesar as a young man. And another interesting point to touch on his life is that after this event, and he participates in politics, he actually attains sort of several positions, because one thing in ancient Rome you didn't need to progress yourself up the ladder was money. And Caesar, he runs for the election of the office of Pontifex Maximus. Now, for those who are familiar, the Pope, his title is Pontifex Maximus. The idea of a chief priest in Rome predates St. Paul. It predates the New Testament. Mm-hmm. These two things actually sort of come together. Caesar himself was a Pontifex Maximus, and he spends stupid amounts of money to win this election, to gain favor. And when he actually departs his home, actually, I should mention too, at 15, maybe I did mention whatever, but at 15, his father dies, so he actually becomes the pater familias, the head of the family, at a very, very young age. At a time where a lot of his peers have their fathers and uncles around to nurture them and educate them, Caesar's doing this himself. And so anyway, he runs for Pontifex Maximus. He borrows an obscene amount of money, bribes, banquets, cajoling, games, as the Romans loved doing in that time. I'm trying to think of how Suetonius put it. Caesar won the affection of many men and also their wives, I think was how Suetonius put it. Yeah. So, he's already a man about town, shall I say.
And I think it's important for people to understand, like, that leveraging of himself that is very much this kind of all-in bet. Like, Caesar's going to climb, right? He's from a house that's out of favor. He doesn't have personal wealth. He knows what he has to do. So he's gaining, he's gaining a reputation through the military, through his actions, obviously avoiding the prescriptions as well. But he also understands that it's not enough to simply be a military man. And so he's willing to go deeply into debt to kind of gamble it all on himself. He's also climbing through these social stations. Religious positions aren't like we think of today. It's not something that you necessarily dedicated your entire life to. You don't become a separate priest and forego.
It's almost more bureaucratic in the ancient world.
Yeah, it's your cursus honorum, in many ways. And so these are all essential steps to him putting himself in a place where he can ascend to the very highest heights. But at each step, he's kind of taking a kind of the maximum risk in all of these situations. Any one of these could have fallen out right from under him. And so we can kind of see in his character what it takes for him to kind of get to where he's going. Yes, he was born of a noble house, an ancient house, but he had to be a very driven man, a man willing to take on massive risks, and had to excel pretty much across the board in order to put himself in the position he ended up in.
Precisely, and just on that sort of basis, just we have to also conceptualize it in the sort of previous round of fighting, of civil infighting. You don't think the brothers Gracchi are killed, and although his uncle Marius is consul, 8 or 10 times, the Populares lose the previous round of infighting. So as a son of the Populares faction, he's on the outer in terms of politics. It'd be like sort of, I mean, it's a bit of a ill-fitting comparison, but if you get my point, it's like, this Republican's has succeeded in Los Angeles, like it's a Democrat stronghold. You know what I mean? Like it's the opposite of the powers that be, as it were. And so Caesar being Popularis, it's difficult for him to gain this traction, but he does. And when he leaves home, when he goes to the forum to attend the ballot for the role of Pontifex Maximus, I believe it's Plutarch who basically quotes Caesar, and he turns to his mother, whose name is Aurelia, and he says to his mother, "I will come home either a priest or a pauper." And it turns out that all of Caesar's hard work and his massive accruement of debts and paying off, and his rubbing of shoulders with all the right people in Rome, he wins. He becomes the Pontifex Maximus for that tenure, which I think 2 years or 5 years. I can't remember the exact. I think it might be 2 years. After which point he then gains a provincial governorship in Spain. For those who are familiar with the city of Tarragona, the Romans call it Tarraco, but that was the capital of the northern province of Spain. Rome and Caesar sent there, and this is another insight into Caesar in terms of like the personality of what comprises Caesar, of a Caesar. In the city of Tarraco was a giant statue of Alexander the Great, and Caesar, a man of already huge ambition. At this point, he's 31, of huge ambition and huge drive. And a huge burden as well. I think he's been carrying the family from the age of 15, and he's got these debts, and he's playing the political game. Like you say, they're playing it for keeps in ancient Rome. He comes across this statue of Alexander the Great, and I mean, he's a man who's well read. Caesar was very much understood his own historical context, and the Romans had a very rich understanding of their own history and that of the Greeks, because you sort of don't have Rome without Greece, if you get my meaning. But he comes across this statue and he just breaks down with frustration and rage that at 31 Alexander had this empire that stretched from western Greece, from the Adriatic Sea all the way to the Indus, and he'd conquered everybody, conquered the Egyptians and the great Persian Empire, and he defeated the Indians, and Alexander ruled the world almost as they knew it. And he Caesar in Spain, with a bird feather pen, and he's writing out lists and filing petitions and arranging trade deals and collecting taxes in a city. Like, for him, it's just not enough. Like, this is pedantry. I'm a nobody. I want to go further. And then eventually, because sort of Caesar's considered this young rising star in Rome, he enters into the first triumvirate, which is between himself, Marcus Crassus, who's the richest Roman essentially in history, and Gnaeus Pompeius, who took over from Sulla in terms of the Eastern campaigns. At this point, Pompey Magnus has incorporated southern, what we sort of understand as southern Turkey today, modern day Syria, down to the Levantine coast. Yeah, he actually pacifies what we call the Levant and Judea and those provinces, and incorporates them into Rome. So he's a celebrated general. He's the man of the hour in a military sense. And these three form a pact. Part of that pact is that Caesar marries off his daughter Julia from his first wife to Pompey. And this sort of secures Caesar's arrangement that gives him governorship over three provinces, which are the Cisalpine Gaul, Transalpine Gaul, and Illyricum. So basically Croatia, northern Italy, southern France. And each province has 2 legions. So Caesar has a force of 6 legions at his disposal. And it's with this army that he actually sort of engages in the Gallic War. He intercepts a tribe we call the Helvetii, which actually is how Switzerland gets its name, Helvetia. The Helvetii might attempt to migrate into Italy. Caesar engages them with his legions, and it's a very hard-fought battle, but the Romans win. And then Caesar basically initiates a campaign into Gaul without senatorial approval. You might say without congressional approval, to use a modern, reference in the American sense. And as a result of circumstances, and I mean, I won't get into the nitty gritty of the Gallic War because we'll be here for 5 hours.
Yeah,
I
easily.
know what I'm like. I know what I'm like. But I'll say this much, that in, you know, it ends up being a success, and this is where sort of Caesar's nascent military abilities really come to the fore. In from 58 BC, he begins his campaign to Gaul. In 55 BC, he's the first man in history to bridge the Rhine River, and he actually engages in a punitive campaign against the Germans who supported the Gauls. In 54 BC, he's the first Roman to ever set foot on Britannia. He leads 2 expeditions to Britannia. And then 8 years of hard fighting, of dirt roads, bloody battles, sieges, counter sieges, forced marches, ambushes, you name it. And I recommend anyone should read Caesar's Gallic War commentaries. They're actually a magnificent read. Just, by and large, they're just a fantastic read. In 8 years, he defeats all 60 tribes of Gaul and incorporates them into the Roman Republic, into Rome. But this also, again, exacerbates that problem of now we're sort of introducing, it's not just a case of what's Rome standing amongst its Italian allies, its Italian neighbors, but how does Rome actually incorporate the Greeks of Macedon, the Greeks of Achaia and Aetolia, which have been annexed in previous times? Rome has acquired Asia, like I said, between Sulla and Pompey. They've brought these territories in from the east that don't share an ethnos with the Romans. They've obviously conquered Carthage several generations earlier. They've been conquering in Spain. And now Caesar has conquered the entirety of Gaul within a decade. And so this actually sets off an even greater, imbalance, I suppose, of the multicultural nature of which Rome is starting to attain, that is proving ever more the insufficiency of the Republican system to work. It's probably the shortest way that I can explain that. And then, of course, there's this problem where Caesar has raised legions to fight in the Gallic War. He actually expands. I think he ends up commanding somewhere in the order of 10 or 12 legions in his Gallic campaigns and against the Brythonic tribes. And then he comes back to Rome, or not to Rome. He's in Ravenna, which is just north of the Rubicon. And this is where this dilemma exists with the Senate. And I know we talk a lot about crossing the Rubicon, and sort of even in our modern day, we have this fascination with it. And there's absolutely no, I think people tend to use it in the right context, in a meta sense, but there's more nuance involved here, is that Caesar basically had 2 choices. Because, I mean, he didn't actually have the entirety of his army with him. He only had a couple legions on the Italian side of the Alps, and most of the rest of his forces were still occupying Gaul to sort of keep, order, because we have to remember that the rebellion of Vercingetorix was a rebellion against Caesar as much as it was Rome. And Caesar had to spend a lot of time suppressing Vercingetorix's rebellion, which culminates in the fantastic Battle of Alesia.
It's a fantastic battle that you should absolutely read about.
Everybody should study, because it's one of the greatest battles of the ancient world. But Caesar basically wins by the skin of his teeth, let's just say that. But he does prevail. And so he's wintering with a couple of legions on the Italian side of the Alps, and eventually there's this standoff. Caesar and his veterans want land because they fought for the Republic. Caesar's probably annexed the greatest amount of territory in a single campaign that any Roman general has ever fought in. Meanwhile, there are people in Rome who want to prosecute him for his misbehaviors in Italy. Actually, I did actually forget to mention Caesar's consulship, because he actually was a consul before he became a provincial governor. That's how he became provincial governor, because he was a consul.
Yeah. So before we go through that too quick, it might be worth explaining to people what that means. So what you do basically is Caesar mortgages the current, hoping for the future, and if you can obtain that consulship, then you can get the governorship. And basically the governorship is the payback. So you spend all of this money, you invest everything, you put on the games, you leverage yourself wildly. And then basically kind of after you obtain this highest rank, you're given the governorship, and that lets you kind of fleece your province for profit. And that's what allows the politician to then kind of pay back all of the money that they attained during this time. And so Caesar's using that, like most people do, but he's also in the situation where he's on kind of, like you said, he's got all of these troops, who want land, and all of this land is locked up by these aristocrats who have in many ways replaced what would be these farmers with the slaves. And where the slaves coming from? Well, funny enough, from conquests like the one in Gaul. And so the very
Correct.
people purchasing the slaves to work the land that otherwise would have been owned by Romans are being funded by this expansion. The people who are funding this expansion by going to war and acquiring these slaves want to come back and get this land, but they can't have the land because the land is owned by the aristocrats who are locking these farms down in these massive kind of villas, these massive plantations, and working it with the very slaves that have been secured by these soldiers in the first place.
Exactly right. Just to touch on the Caesar being consul things is probably important, is that in terms of why people were prosecuting him. See, when he was consul, because like I said, Caesar had this sort of nascent band of followers and people who were really enthusiastic and did support him, and you might say saw potential in Caesar. He's co-consul for the year. I actually can't remember what year it was. I want to say it was 61 BC, but I could be wrong. 62, 61 BC maybe. Because you couldn't be a consul prior to the age of 42. That was a Roman law in the Republican days. Caesar's co-consul Bibulus was basically constantly harassed by Caesar's, you might say, his ultras, like his hooligans. And there were times where Bibulus simply couldn't walk out of his front door because he'd be pelted with just dung, and he'd be spat on and castigated. So Bibulus never went to the Senate. So Caesar, as the one consul attending Senate, would pass bills essentially. So he kind of, you might say, cheated a bit as consul, and his peers, particularly those on the opposite side, the optimates, who you might say held a more purist interpretation of Roman law and of the state, saw this as egregious. And to some degree, I think they were right to think that, because these were men who considered their participation in politics as their cultural and political birthright, which Caesar kind of circumvented. His attitude's probably being, well, you prescribed half of my family and most of their friends, so let's play dirty, I suppose would have been Caesar's mentality, right, if you get my drift. So anyway, if we fast forward to him being in Ravenna with these couple of legions, and let's not forget, the Gallic Wars were very hard fought. Many of these legions, none of them are full strength. Many of them are even partial strength, half strength. They're weakened legions. To use a line out of HBO's Rome, when the character playing Pompey mentions that, it's like he's got one mutinous skeleton of a legion. He dares dictate terms to me. Like, that's exactly the position Caesar found himself in. But in some ways, this is sort of Caesar also playing games. Like, he's got these other troops, he just doesn't have them on hand. He wants to, in some ways, portray weakness. To use that sort of Sun Tzu's principle: when you're strong, feign weakness; if you're weak, feign strength.
And just to give a little context there, because I think you skipped over a little bit, he has been threatened multiple times by the Senate. He needs to return for trial, and he just keeps ignoring it and conquering more and more. And so the Senate has
they want to prosecute him actively,
right? And so he's in a situation where basically he had to win these wars just to keep from being returned. And if he goes back, he knows he's against the wall, because the very people who he would return to are politically motivated to make sure that this guy who is promising a lot of people land that they don't want to give up to people who were bringing in all the slaves that they needed in the first place, they're really motivated to bury this guy, whether he should have been tried and found guilty for all these violations or not. Either way, he is already they're already heavily incentivized to kind of get rid of this guy who is causing a lot of social problems for them, political problems for them at home, even though he's winning glory abroad.
Precisely. And the thing is, his victories in Gaul made not only the Roman state wealthy itself, I mean, and this is where this starts to touch a sensitive nerve in, you might say, the morality of modern people. I mean, Caesar and his troops are probably responsible for the death of 1 million Gauls. And they would place anywhere from 1.5 to 2 million Gauls, further Gauls into captivity and slavery. So it's quite the disaster that befalls Gaul. And this is even why, like, if you go to France today and study the Gallic Wars, the French call it l'année terrible, the terrible years. And I mean, the French are kind of like this mix of, Gauls, Roman Latins, Frankish Germans. The French have evolved a lot since this time, but the French today still call it that. They still call it l'année terrible. It's an interesting sort of insight. But anyway, you're quite right. So Caesar is left in this position of he goes to Rome, he goes to trial, and it'll be one of the situations where we, if we can draw inverted commas, trialed by his peers. But they're mostly his ideological enemies. They're sort of Cato, they're Pompey, they're Scipio Metellus. They're all these people that basically want Caesar's head. Cicero to a point as well, who don't like him and see him as a disruptor to their divine order as the Republic was. And then meanwhile, there's a bit of a push and pull thing which needs to be articulated with Caesar. You mentioned the pull thing, like Caesar, from a personal standpoint, needs to succeed. If he fails, at the very least, he stands to be exiled and be stripped of everything. At the very worst, he's going to be thrown off the Tarpeian Rock. He will be executed for his crimes, or his alleged crimes by his enemies, because there's no Roman general who had ever conquered a province or a territory who didn't sort of commit what we would in today call heinous crimes, right? So that's Caesar's personal position. And then there's the position of his men who have fought hard for Caesar in the Gallic Wars. They have earned their citizenship. They have earned their rights as retired soldiers. They've earned their right to ask for land, because that's what the Roman state promises them when they sign up. So the soldiers are pushing Caesar, and he's pulling them along, if you get what I mean. There's this push and pull factor that coexists with these two principles. And so Caesar basically, why the Rubicon? And I mean, I'm obviously a person who enjoys the personality of Caesar. I find him one of the most fascinating people of all history, never mind ancient history. But he conjures up when he's sort of at this point where he must act one way or another. There's a phraseology. People sort of say, "Oh, humans have fight or flight." There's actually a third response, and this is probably the worst response of all: is fight, flight, and freeze. At the very least, if you run away, you might fight another day, and if you fight, you might win. But to freeze is to just condemn yourself to you're going to get shot or something, or you're going to like get rolled over. Like, freeze is the worst thing. And most men, when faced with the ultimate decision, freeze. And rather than freezing, what does Caesar do? He jumps on his horse, he leads his men, he crosses the Rubicon, he commits the most heinous crime in Rome of marching men into Italy. Once Caesar is on the opposite bank of the Rubicon with his weapons and his arms and armor, he is a traitor to the Roman Republic. He is an enemy. He's a public enemy, and it would be within the right of any Roman citizen to kill or capture Caesar, and then the state would be within their rights to seize all property. But Caesar, at the head of a partial legion, beelines it to Rome, and doesn't give the Senate time, even with Pompey as sort of the he sort of becomes this de facto dictator in Rome. Not enough time to organize a defense. And funny enough, there's one legion which is loyal to Pompey, which is only a half legion. And then there's another legion in Rome, but it's actually one of Caesar's old legions, and they can't depend on their loyalty because Caesar at this point already has a bit of a cult of personality. His men love him. Right. You actually see it throughout the Gallic Wars, like his men do extraordinary feats because they follow him. And he does fight alongside his men. He's one of the few generals not few, many fight alongside the generals, but he places himself in positions of danger and earns the respect of his men. And that's what makes him so well liked by his followers. And so this legion that has fought under Caesar, it's like, can we depend on them? The Senate, or Pompey basically says, no, we can't. So they evacuate Rome and they take the treasure with them and they make their way south. Caesar marches into Rome, without opposition and conquers the city. Now, I'm sure we don't want to get into the nuts and bolts of the Civil War. Again, that would add 2 hours of the stream. Yeah. But in a nutshell, Caesar engages the senatorial forces. He has some setbacks in Greece, but eventually the two forces come to face each other at a place called Pharsalus in Greece. And this is arguably probably, if not Alesia, Pharsalus is probably one of Caesar's greatest victories, because up until this point, Pompey is probably still the greatest general. That's why the Romans call him Pompey Magnus, Pompey the Great. And Caesar's outnumbered by around 2-1, and Pompey outnumbers him 4-1 in cavalry, which in ancient warfare, to have a cavalry advantage was sort of an advantage in itself, if you get what I mean, mobility and flanking and that sort of stuff. But Caesar pulls off an astonishing victory with his back to the wall, sends the Pompeian senatorial army to flight. And at this point, a number of senators actually sort of come groveling back to Caesar. And then the sort of civil war continues. They go to Egypt and North Africa, and they go back to Spain. Actually, Caesar starts the civil war in Spain. But anyway, Caesar becomes triumphant triumphant in the civil war. And rather than he takes the opposite avenue of, or the opposite route of Sulla. He doesn't prescribe his enemies. Actually, he's extremely lenient. He preserves their property. He actually says to anyone who comes over, because after Pharsalus, Brutus comes over, Cicero comes over, and this actually takes this saps a lot of the fighting strength out of the legitimacy out of the Pompeian cause. Is because a lot of the senators who sort of thought, well, we have to preserve the Republic by joining Pompey and defeating Caesar, end up sort of thinking, well, Caesar's won, and we have to accommodate ourselves with the new regime, the nouvelle regime, if I can use the French term. And
turns out kind of once the wheel turns, not that many people were actually invested in the Republic, and they're more than happy to follow whoever's in charge.
They want their warm marble seat in the Senate House. Like that's their birthright. That's what they're more worried about, and also their property. It's like, oh, well, I don't want to anger Caesar. If I have this chance at clemency, I don't want to piss off Caesar. So, I mean, I don't know how much further we want to go into it, because, I mean, we can always talk about the assassination and this sort of stuff, but
yeah, I think people are probably familiar with the assassination.
That's the most famous aspect of it.
Exactly. That if you've watched the Shakespeare play or anything, if you've watched the movies or anything like that, then you're probably familiar with how that went down.
Exactly. And so let's just say that he's assassinated by his peers, many of whom he offered clemency to, because again, it might be Plutarch who says this, that Caesar quipped that he'd rather just die once than to constantly fear death. And because Caesar was always a man of the people, like even in his early days when he was becoming the Pontifex Maximus, or he's becoming consul, and he was as a popularis, his constituency was the people in Rome. He never marched around with a bodyguard. He wasn't a person who sort of put a bridge between himself and the people. Like, he'd shake the commoners' hand if he was in the forum, they'd go to him and give them his petitions, and he'd read them. He's like, in some ways, Caesar's a bit cynical. Yes, he's a political, he engaged in political maneuver, but there's probably part of him, especially as a result of his youth, who probably actually genuinely believes in this cause. There's probably a little bit of both at hand. Yes, there's Caesar with the ambition, Caesar, the man who wants success, the man who actually famously says, I'd rather be first in a barbarian village than second in Rome. But there's also this conviction that Rome has fundamental problems, and this side of politics is actually wanting to deal with it. We can't maintain things as they are. This political system that served Rome as a city-state, that served Rome as a regional power in Latium or in Italy, or Italia as the Romans would call it, worked. But this pan-Mediterranean power, where there's legions and governors, and there's huge amounts of taxation money coming in, and people can engage in corruption, and there's legions everywhere, and generals can sort of engage in whatever wars of conquest they can, and then the generals march home and engage in a civil war. Like, this system doesn't work. It's fundamentally broken. And I think the populares understand that far more than the optimates do. And so I guess from that point, we're now transition the discussion towards what is Caesarism conceptually, and I suppose how in the modern day are we looking for the traits of someone who reflects a Caesar? I suppose, is that where you want to steer this, Auron?
Yeah, so I think now at this point we've established kind of the world that Caesar was born into and the forces that were impacting him, and then we have the personal history and Caesar the man. But I wanted to get into, because again, this is somebody who I always find fascinating, and I think is well worth looking at real quick. Oswald Spengler has kind of these political epochs that go along with his morphology of civilizations. And I want to zoom out a little.
Can I interject briefly? I was going to say, I'm surprised I did that within an hour. Sorry, I actually surprised myself. I did that within an hour.
Sorry, there was definitely a speed run there. You should win some kind of much more impressive than getting through Mario or something. You should. No, we covered it, and guys, we covered an enormous amount of history there. Like Furius was saying, if you read anything out of this, read the war journals of Caesar. I mean, it's really fascinating. You can get all of the stuff from the Gallic Wars. You can get all of the stuff from the Civil Wars, and just the stories of Caesar, like quickly building a fleet and chasing Pompey down, even though he's like wildly undermanned. Like, those are just great stories. You should absolutely read them. They're fascinating, even if you're not a history person. Like, just as tales of battle.
Caesar's anecdotes are wonderful.
They really are.
And also they're an education in like human behavior as well, and psychology. Like, when you sort of think about what some of Caesar's followers do for him and the cause is outrageous. But anyway, if you want a question, send us a super chat. We'll answer at the end of the show, but let's push on.
Yeah, no, I love that he
Yeah.
like stops in the middle of nowhere and just like will have a an autist moment where he explains exactly how a bridge was constructed. He's like, yeah, I'm gonna build this bridge. Here's everything about how I'm gonna sink the pylons and blah blah blah. Like it's like let's have an engineering moment in the middle of
Yeah.
my war diary. But that said, I want to look at kind
Exactly.
of the larger meta understanding of Caesarism. So Spengler has this morphology of civilizations, and inside of it, he has these political epochs. And so there's this pre-cultural period, which is what it says here. If you guys can see it here, the primitive folk and tribes and chieftains. You don't have the state per se, and so you don't have our understanding of more complex politics. But then you move into what he calls the cultural phase, and this is really where he thinks that most civilizations are doing their most impressive work. You start with feudalism, where people are still kind of tied to the land, where people still have a very direct existence with kind of the work of their hands, and things are still very regional. There's a lot of power tied into the nobility and kind of the areas that they control, and he kind of goes through all these different parts of state formation, the kind of how these regional lords maybe lose a little bit of power and it ends up getting consolidated. But this civilizational phase, this is the one we're going to focus on, because this is where Caesar comes in. Now, for Spengler, the civilizational phase is kind of the beginning of the end. We think of civilization, of course, as the apex, right? Like, oh, you're civilized. This is a state you enter into, and this is where you're highly advanced. But Spengler sees this as kind of the beginning of the end, because during the civilizational phase, this is where the metaphysical animating spirit, the kind of the raw energy, the driving force of the ethnos and the belief in religion and all of these things starts to move from the realm of the spiritual and the metaphysical and the divine into the realm of the material. And many of the traditions, the animating spirits, the things that were driving your civilization go from being something that is highly religious and believed in a very authentic way, to something that is being acted out by kind of these systems in your civilization. Those rites, those rituals, those spiritual things are translated into kind of a more something that is built into the system. You build institutions that carry this forward, rather than it being kind of an organic part of your civilization. And when this happens, we see expansion. He talks a lot, Spengler, about the need for expansion becoming kind of a integral part of the civilizational phase. Civilizational epochs are kind of defined by the desperate need for expansion, and also that money power becomes a big deal. Money, with this expansion, money becomes a driving force, because material excess exists in a way that it never did before. And so we're moving out of kind of that moment where we talked about with Marius, where that pivot from, okay, our civilization, our service in the military is based on honor and duty, tradition. I'm a free Roman who holds the land. It is my honor to be part of the military, and I have to provide my own equipment, buy my own horse. That puts me in a certain status in society, that I'm able to do that. It goes from that to being, okay, well, we have to have a military because we're going to drive this expansion, and the expansion is driving our economic engine, and so that has to continue. And that economic engine changes the way that our government operates. And from that, money power starts to dominate everything, and this is where the Caesar figure comes in, because once money power has dominated everything, the only thing that can kind of shake things up, that can change things, is the reintroduction of kind of direct force. And so
Mm.
that's kind of where I want to bring you back in, Furious, here, and look at Caesarism from this angle. Caesarism as kind of a paradigm shift from that money power early civilizational phase, to one in which the Caesar figure comes in and kind of breaks, cuts through the Gordian knot, to mix our heroic figures here, and breaks through this problem of money and institutions being kind of corrupt and locked into this expansionist phase, and creates something new that kind of makes civilization kind of function again, but in a way that is still tied to what existed before, but is also a fundamental shift.
Yeah, just to buttress one thing you said there at the end,
Sure.
it's also evidence too of and one might say it's the adaptability of the Romans, because if a person goes into the early part of Apostolic Majesty's catalog, to the very first stream I did with him, we actually talked about Gaul, and I ran off a whole list of things that the Romans kind of copied off their neighbors, the helmets and the shields and this and that, by fighting their enemies. The Romans were a hugely adaptive people, particularly early in their history. And so the Romans were perceptive, you might say, to their own weaknesses, to a point, and it's what made the Romans, I think, outrageously successful, certainly in the first half of the civilization of Rome. If you're talking in the classical Latin context, I'm not talking about Byzantium at this point. But it's almost in some ways a recognition of the Romans themselves of, okay, and particularly I think Marius gets to the nub of it, of that, okay, there's this system that we've had for centuries, and it worked whilst we were regional powers and we had our Latin League allies, and we're fighting Pyrrhus because he's a Greek person invading Rome, or we're fighting the Carthaginians because they're just across the sea. This system works in this dimension. But then with this sort of pan-Mediterranean sort of empire in all but name, we have these, successive, politician generals and these constant civil wars. This system isn't working. It is atrophied and it's broken down. And about the soldier, the transition of the soldier from that sort of honorable duty and obligation bound service to a monetary incentive volunteer force that becomes a standing professional army, which, I mean, you're American. I'm not telling you something you don't know, but I mean, even the founding fathers to some degree understood, and they would have understood this by having knowledge about Rome, that a standing army is something that, for people who value freedom in the true sense of the word, a standing army can be a risk. Not always, but can be a risk to that. And so there's this recognition that by having hollowed out that class, that strata of the citizens, of the landed citizen soldier, the Romans realized, okay, the system doesn't work. We've actually, through this expansion, through this desire to expand Rome and to defeat the enemies that have faced us, we've actually gutted ourselves at the same time. We need a new military system. So there's also that consideration as well. I know it's a bit of a divergence, but I figured that was an important point to make.
No, it is. And again, I think it's funny. Most people don't understand that America, had a healthy fear of standing armies. One of the things that happened is we got rid of the Articles of Confederation and gained a constitution because the government couldn't put down a rebellion after the government attempted to go back and tax a bunch of farmers. And the farmers are like, wait, we just fought Britain over taxation. We're just going to go ahead and fight you. And America, because it didn't have a standing army, wasn't able to put down the rebellious farmers who didn't want to pay massive amounts of taxes and have their homes seized by banks. So funny enough, the Constitution is actually a centralization of government power and the creation of the ability of the government to force these people to pay taxes.
Exactly. Just briefly, if my Auron, they're obviously a bit different because one's a military context, one's an economic context. But in terms of like the system cannibalizing itself to survive itself, I consider the Italic manpower problem of the Roman army, sort of, if I can make the equivalent example in America, it'd be like, to sort of keep this American US dollar hegemony project up and running, they've kind of gutted what we call the Rust Belt states. They've gutted American industry so that, Americans can have cheap imported consumables, and, they can have a service economy that doesn't require massive cost, to build factories and expand factories and man factories. They sort of keep the illusion alive by gutting itself. That's how kind of America's done it, less from a military standpoint, but from more of an economic standpoint. But it's that dynamic between the system will cannibalize and atrophy itself to keep it alive, but it hollows itself out even more. It's this downward spiral that it can't escape from itself. And I think that's where the comparisons are actually probably most vivid in my mind.
Yeah, this is Bertrand de Juvenel's famous high and low versus middle. The powers that be will hollow out the middle in alliance with outliers, periphery populations, in order to undermine the middle, so that the top can get stronger. And so that's what happened in Rome as the middle, the kind of the freedmen who own land would have been farmers, are sent off to war. they're
The soldier
hollowed out.
kulaks.
Yeah, they're hollowed out so that the guys back home can get a bunch of slaves and acquire a bunch of land and
Mm,
become more powerful through this expansion. Same thing, like you're saying, we can very much see this happening in America, where Middle America is sacrificed, both as fighters in the military and through the offshoring of jobs and the outsourcing
mm,
of economic and middle class wealth, for the elite coastal elites end up becoming fatter and growing fatter on this, and the system just
mm.
keeps cannibalizing itself because the elites
Yeah,
aren't going to take a step down in their standard of living, and so they need to strip more and more wealth out of the middle, and they do that by kind of farming everything out
mm,
to the periphery. It just, in our case, the periphery is expanded to a global empire, and so
correct.
you can kind of easily see the parallels there. But we have a lot of
And
questions.
the Romans, I was just going to say, the Romans couldn't offshore their production as well. Like it's a very
Yeah.
different era with different things at
Well,
play.
they did.
Um,
So the interesting thing about the Romans is they
you know,
offshored their food production, right? So instead of being able to farm and feed their
mm.
populace through Roman farms, they ended up having to use Egypt as the breadbasket of the empire, right?
Yeah,
And so
I mean, they did annex Egypt to make it easier, but yes, the analogy does ring true because for about 50 years that was the case. They actually had a trade agreement with Egypt specifically for grain, so it's a good point. Yeah,
yeah, so this
yeah,
the dynamic is not as, because we don't have the
yeah,
same level of political, or just logistical interaction. You don't
yeah,
have the same abilities to offshore this stuff, but that dynamic existed even
mm,
back then. So again, this is
yeah,
something we see over and over again:
mhm,
historical cycles. This metaphysics of power, these mechanics, they are eternal. They
mm,
apply themselves differently, but they continue. We see their echoes, we see their repetition,
mm,
and so I think that's why a lot of people see the possibility of Caesar figures now, because we're obviously in a situation where we're looking at that hollowed out empire. We're looking at the empire having stretched itself far too much for the benefit of the few, hollowing out the middle. We see the situation where money power dominates everything. No one can imagine a situation where everyone is not ruled by the dollar, is not ruled by billionaires are the only people who can really contest each other. But again, we
yeah,
saw that Caesar played the game of money power, right? He leveraged himself up to the nines. He put himself in a situation where, even though he had to go deeply into debt and put risk at all, he was able to play the money power game for a while. But eventually, he brings a very different type of power to the board. And so I
yeah,
think when we kind of look at what this might mean for our times now, it's
yeah,
that transition between, yeah, anyone who's going to be a player is going to need the money power, but that transition to a possibility of someone looking to come in and shake up the game is still there. It's hard for us to imagine, because we, like the people of Caesar's time, are stuck in this historical cycle, and we can't imagine that things
mm,
ever change, but they do
yeah.
over and over again in a very similar way.
And I think what's unique about Julius Caesar himself, in terms of like this power dynamic, and touching on people like the Juvenal and Spengler and whatever, and we sort of have these analogies. Like for example, I can't remember. You know, or I'm pretty sure, but the idea of foxes and wolves, and the
But
way in which
foxes and
they,
lions, Pareto's
yeah,
foxes and
yeah,
lions.
yeah,
Yeah.
it's Pareto, yeah. Caesar's almost a bit of both, because on one hand he plays the political game in Rome, and he's more daring than his competitors. He goes into more depth than his competitors. He's willing to literally go all in. To use a poker analogy, go all in on the pot, on becoming Pontifex Maximus, on becoming consul, on becoming governor. He wins each time. He does all the the smoothing over and the corralling and the bribing and stuff. But then he's also a soldier. He was a centurion. He led troops at a young age, and when he was then a governor general. And I mean, I think Plutarch mentions it quite vividly when he sort of says that Caesar always had to be the first man. He had to do everything at once. He'd put up the battle flag, and he'd call out the centurions, calling each one by name, and he'd grab a shield from a soldier at the back, and he'd run to the front, and he'd shout encouragement to the men. He's got aspects of both, which I think made him hugely successful. And I just want to touch on, I know you want to get to questions, Auron, so I'll keep this brief, but just because I think I've seen a bit of this in the chat, I think why we call this Caesarism and not Alexanderism or Napoleonism or whatever. And I have to say, I think if we want to get to analogies a tad later, we can always do so, or comparisons. But I think the reasons why it's those well, I mean, Napoleon came a long time after Caesar, so it's kind of neither here nor there. But and also someone mentioned Cyrus the Great. These are kings who inherit kingdoms off their forebears. They inherit an army. They inherit a bureaucracy. This is true of Philip II and of Cyrus. They engage in wars of to stave off competitors for their throne, and then they engaged outwards expansion in their respective careers, as Alexander and Cyrus did. What is unique about Caesar is that he functions within this polity as a republic is, and he's actually starts off on the losing side of that, being from the Popularis faction. He then works his way up at great personal risk, both physical and monetary risk. And he should have, there's many times that he could have faltered or have been undercut or have just lost his life, but he doesn't. He succeeds until that point of the Rubicon. And this is one man, not just pitted against another man. It's not just Caesar v. Pompey. It's not just Caesar v. whatever. It is Caesar versus the Roman state, the Roman Senate, the Roman treasury, all its politicians, all its, its financial might, all of the friends and allies of Pompey and his Eastern, friends, from his conquest days. It's one man against this system that doesn't like him nor what he represents. And I think when we were talking in the chat, or lining up this stream in the last couple of weeks, this is actually what I want to get into. This is the point about when we use the phraseology crossing the Rubicon. It's exactly that. And I think, for example, shall I say, when Trump stepped down at the end of his presidency, if I can keep it in those terms, and people were like, oh, he didn't do a Caesar, whatever. It's just like, yes, that's exactly right. Because, and this is why I think the system detests Caesar. It's why it detests people like Napoleon. It detests people, shall I say, like the big chin man in Italy in the interwar period. That those that have the capacity and the will to march on that capital city and go against the system frightens the system, very fundamentally so. And Caesar's probably the first man in history that does it against the state within which he's a participant of. He then tackles it and prevails against it. And I think that definition of Caesarism matters, if you get my drift.
I do. And also, I think it's important that, for instance, Spengler draws a distinction between Napoleon and Caesar, or Alexander and Caesar. He sees both Napoleon and Alexander as men of some level of poetry. He said there's still some romance in what they're doing. He sees Caesar as a man of complete shrewd will. And so he sees this, the transition between, the difference between someone like Napoleon and Alexander versus someone like Caesar, as the kind of Napoleon and Alexander are still animated in some way by myth, by that metaphysical spirit, by at least some level of that echo of romance, as where Caesar is a true will to power, which in some ways makes him even more ruthless and able to do even more wild things, but also means he's part of a different phase of civilization. It's what Spengler calls the second religiousness. That would take us far too much time. We've already run too late.
Of course.
But just to say, there are similarities, of course, but not every great leader is a Caesar. There's a very specific set of that, and that's why I want us to focus on the history around and the forces creating, because there is a very specific way in which a Caesar is born and a time of Caesarism is born. And they are distinct from just someone who's a great military leader or a great conqueror.
So. Exactly. And just very briefly, just because it's popped into my head, before we get to the questions, because the thing is, we have a lot of these writers that talk about the kind of people that we read, Spengler and Juvenal and others, I suppose Evola to an extent, and others. The way in which they sort of frame these topics brings about something which has occurred to me quite often. And you look at, say, for example, Caesar at the command of his legions. You sort of see the same of Napoleon gaining notoriety, as an artillery commander at the siege of Toulon, and then sort of he's given a ragtag bunch of troops in Italy and partakes in this whole Italian campaign, which both Apostolic Majesty I've covered in our streams as well. And then he sort of, he's the man of the moment in the same way that sort of Caesar was, or in a similar way, becomes the first consul of France, then becomes emperor of France.
We can't go over all of Napoleon. We gotta go.
Certainly not. But then, for example, just as another thing is, it's worth mentioning Prussia, the Kingdom of Prussia, because there's an old saying, or reflecting on Prussia, that most states have an army. The Prussian army has a state. And I think the important thing about the system, as in the one that we live under today, sees that external power base as very much a threat. And as we've seen too, like you got to think, in the time that we've been personalities in this sphere. I mean, you predate me by some margin, but even the transition of, say, how we imagined the American armed forces under Trump, and then how they've rapidly transformed under Biden, and how they've almost been co-opted by the regime for its purposes. It basically acts as, at home, it keeps it bound together, and then it's exported beyond the borders in terms of the ideology as such. That they want to keep that power inboard, because if it's exported, if it's outboard, and someone like a Caesar or a Napoleon, or Frederick the Great for that matter, can actually harness that discontent and harness that capacity and use it to sort of, dare I say, cross the Rubicon in a hypothetical context, it is of an existential danger to the regime. And that's why the regime has actually co-opted those things and integrated it into its system. And I think that's just a note that's very worth mentioning, because I know there are people who, we got to support the cops and, pro-blue, and, support the boys, support the army, and this sort of stuff. It's like, well, what matters to people like us is seeing things as they are, not as we imagine them or we wish them to be. And I think that's an important point. And I'll leave it there, because I know you want to move to questions.
Yeah, we need to. But yeah, that is a topic that I've gone into to a good extent with American Ostracon. So if anyone wants to look more into that topic, we have talked about that in depth as well. All right, so let's go ahead and move over here. Actually, before we get to the questions of the people, Furious, is there anything that you want to shill, anything you want to let people know that you're working on or that they should check out before we get to the questions of the people?
Well, I have obviously mentioned Apostolic Majesty. That's where I do the majority of my co-hosting. Apostolic Majesty and I basically cover any subject historically from the Bronze Age up until probably the end of the Second World War. We recently did 2 streams, one about the alternative potential outcomes of World War One, and then the week after we did the inverse of that as well. At the moment, when we finish, because our streams with Apostolic Majesty never short. Once we finish here with Auron, please go over to Apostolic Majesty, because they are streaming about the grand strategy of Stalin. Today's part 1. And because Auron and I already had this planned, I wasn't able to sit on that. But then part 2 will be, I think, the following week, which I will be on with, and we'll wrap up. So by all means, check out Apostolic Majesty, because his channel is fantastic. I don't always stream with him, but we often stream together. And to attain a perspective of history, you might say from our perspective, that is sort of contaminated with a modernist lens, his channel is excellent, and I can only think the highest of it. And that's all I really have to shill Auron. So thank you. And also I appreciate the chance to talk about this today. As you know, Caesar is one of my favorite subjects from a historical standpoint. So I never had an opportunity to talk about Julius Caesar.
No, I appreciate it. It's been fascinating, and everyone should definitely check out the streams with Apostolic Majesty. All right, so let's go to our questions here, guys. First one, Florida Henry for $10. Greetings. Who is more important, Sulla, Caesar, or Augustus? Without Augustus, Caesar would be much less famous, and Caesar basically copied Sulla. Yeah, I mean, obviously, none of these can be seen, I think, as separate entities. Each one feeds into the other, as we obviously established on this stream. Caesar is a man of his time. He's extraordinary, but he's also kind of forced into the position he is by extraordinary circumstances. One of those things is Sulla, and of course, the situation that was created. But if you had to kind of pick one, who would you think of as kind of the linchpin here?
I'll answer it this way. I think Augustus is the greatest insofar that he then succeeds. He basically achieves what Caesar doesn't, and achieves the zenith of what a man can accomplish in an era of tumult, and climb to the top and survive and become emperor, which is what Augustus does. But, and I say a big but, I consider Caesar the greatest of the men, because Caesar is the man who literally has to cross the Rubicon. He's the man who picks up if I may use a mythological analogy, Thor's hammer, and he smashes it against the system that is ossified and corrupt, and he irretrievably fractures it. He's the man who is the breaking point of the ossifying system and allows it to transition to something which, you might say, evolves into something new. And you can't, no Caesar, that process doesn't happen. Certainly not in the way that we know in our present timeline as history transpired. And I think also when you look at the career of Caesar, you look at his inauspicious beginnings, the difficulty of his youth, the fact that he dodged death a number of times very early on, and he's just this precocious, self-confident, self-assured, ambitious, to a degree almost like disgustingly so, but he climbs to the very top and he succeeds in almost every dimension. He's a man who fights all these different people and prevails against them. And he leads with such great tenacity and adaptability, and he's a fantastic leader of men that I actually find him hard to. I almost, in some ways, almost consider him greater than Alexander in some respects. I'll leave that for another stream to explain why.
Yeah, that could be a whole other stream for sure.
But I think it's worth making that distinction, as in Augustus achieves what Caesar doesn't, but Caesar's lifespan and his accomplishments are unparalleled, if that makes sense, if that differentiation makes sense.
I think it does. All right, so Daniel Robinson here for $1.99. The cycle won't repeat due to multipolar Caesarism. Oh, well, that's an interesting thing to say, Daniel. I mean, first, we need multipolarity, which we don't have. We have a unipolar system right now. But should things move to a multipolar situation, it would probably have to be through some level of Caesarism, I would imagine, though it could simply be because, the United States isn't able to keep its position. I mean, if we see the collapse of the petrodollar, then that could bring upon us a multipolar moment, and in which then possibility of Caesars could rise. But obviously every historical epoch does have variations. They're not exact photocopies of each other, and so we will not see exactly what has come before, but it is that echoes of the cycle that I think are most important to focus on, because those are really the only things that can help us better understand the context that we're in. Daniel,
I
again,
would agree with that.
Excellent. Daniel again here for $4.99. Trump naturally fits the Caesar role for the West, but makes RFK Jr. his VP to bring in the few libs who remain lucid and really don't want World War III. I mean, yeah, obviously, many people talked about Trump in this context. I don't think Trump is that person. Trump is the personification of money power. He certainly talks a good game, many good things about Trump. But I do not think that Trump has those inclinations. A lot of people have talked about fishing in the Rubicon, I think was the phrase that
Actually,
was
I like
coined.
that.
Yeah, that was, I think,
it's
Curtis.
quite clever.
Yeah, Curtis Yarvin used that about Trump
Yeah.
fishing in the Rubicon. And I think that's what that was, which, is a dangerous place to be. As the Game of Thrones line goes, you play and you win, or you die. Those are kind of your options. Chase here for $2. Will Tucker become a Caesar? I love Tucker, but again, I don't know that Tucker perhaps a little more aristocratic in many ways than Trump. Trump does come from a family of money, but Tucker feels a little more like he has that. Though I will say that Donald Trump does have even though he's a bit crass, does have the ability to communicate with the people and interact with higher levels of society. So he's not completely unaristocratic either. But I would again love Tucker, but I don't know that I'd put him in the Caesar category.
If I may say so, Auron, I think the difference is you need someone who is sort of like rambunctious and just totally, in the same way that sort of Trump has like a callous skin, like he'll just attack as he did like in the 2016 election and just rebuff blows. You need someone of that nature who just goes in, edge of the wedge, tip of the spear into the discussion point, irrespective of what people think about him. But at the same time, you do see the deficiencies. Like, Trump had sort of natural instincts about the economy or about foreign adventures or defense or whatever, which were true. But at the same time, where I sort of see more virtue in someone like Tucker is that he's clearly more erudite. He's clearly more well-read. He clearly thinks about things in a more cerebral way. And what you actually kind of need is to like mash Trump. You need to mash Tucker and Trump into the one person, because you'd have both of those traits that would serve each other well, because you can definitely see that one without the other is a bit lacking, particularly in Trump's case. It's like, if this man had read, Edward Luttwak or Suetonius or something, he might be more rounded. So That's just how I see it personally.
Nope, I think that's fair. All right, so double dime here for $5. Awesome stream, gents. Well, thank you very much, sir. I appreciate
Thank
that.
you. Hope the rest of you all enjoyed it as well. But thank you,
Yeah,
Double Dog.
I think it has been good. Covered a lot of ground in the amount of time that we had. Very impressive speed run again by Furious and the
I
little
surprised
bit.
myself, to be honest with you, Auron.
A lot of condensed history there. Orwell's Goon for $9.99. It's clear that the worst, most destructive ideas of history came from the Enlightenment, namely in France and Germany. There's such a thing as benevolent dictator, just usually not hereditarily. Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's we didn't have time. Maybe we can plan a future stream, Furious, where we can talk about the office of dictator, because I know
Oh my
you.
God, yes.
Yeah, let's do that, because I don't know if you've ever read Schmidt's book about dictatorship.
I actually haven't, but if we are planning it in the future, I'll definitely acquire it and read it. Because if it's worth doing,
let's make that a thing. You go ahead and grab that book. It's a fascinating look at the power of the Roman dictator and what that means, and then kind of the wider implications of dictators throughout history. And so that might be something that we can plan in the future. But thanks, you Orwell's Goon, for your donation and for that idea. I think that could be a fascinating thing to
absolutely. But just to sort of, I suppose, get to the nub of that question, I just want to say very quickly that there's two words that are used in common parlance that absolutely just make me irate. And one is, like, say for example, if you're watching like a sports team, it's like, the Miami Dolphins, like, decimated the whatever another team is, it's like, no, 1 in 10 men weren't like killed on the playing field.
That's
like,
not what decimation means. Yeah,
decimation actually has a means. Decimation has a definition that exists. There's any number of words in the English dictionary you could use. They annihilated them, or they crushed them. Or
to be fair, that's a very history geek specific thing. Like, I hear you, but
exactly.
Yes,
but the other one is dictator. And you watch any number of news networks, or even discussions amongst intellectuals, or even if you want to catch parts of BreadTube or whatever. I mean, we can have Dave to as our advisor on that one. But
he watches, so you don't have to. Yeah,
exactly. But this usage of the word dictate just really gets up my goat. And as someone who's studied a lot of Roman history, is that like the office of dictator was actually a specific role that served a specific purpose, and actually served the Roman state and people very well early in its history. Like, for those who sort of know my screen name, the reason I have Furius in there is because Marcus Furius, unless Marcus Furius Pertinax, Marcus Furius Camillus is one of my. He's sort of almost semi-mythological in the same way that Cincinnatus is, but he's called the second founder of Rome, and he's made dictator, and then because of a you might say a political transition in Rome, he's disempowered and sent to exile. And then when the Romans desperately need him, they call him back out of exile, and he actually saves Rome from the Senones, who are a tribe of the Cisalpine Gauls. And like the office of dictator served the Roman Republic well, and a number of men were elected dictator by their peers. And it's not what people say it is. It's a deeply misunderstood word that has gained a parlance in modern day that doesn't reflect what it is.
Well, that's correct, and I think we will go ahead and just do a whole stream on that. So let's not answer that whole question.
But I did want to answer that super chat because it deserves to be answered. But all good.
Yeah, no, we'll get deeper into that, because I do think it's a fascinating thing that deserves far more time. So we'll do that. All right, guys. Absolutely. Well, I really appreciate everyone coming by. Furious, again, just an amazing speed run there. I really appreciate your ability to pack all that historical knowledge into a short time. Make sure that you check out his streams with Apostolic Majesty. And of course, if it's your first time here, guys, go ahead and subscribe to this channel. If you want to get these broadcasts as podcasts, please go ahead and subscribe to the Auron MacIntyre Show on all your favorite podcast platforms. And if you do that, a little bit of the old rating and review just helps out a whole bunch. If you take just a minute or two to do that, makes a big difference. So really appreciate it. All right, guys. Again, thanks for coming on, thanks for being here. Thanks to Furious for coming on. And as always, I'll talk to you next time.